I was standing on the deck of the ship, my fingers gripping the cold, rusted railing. The wind howled through the darkening sky, and the ocean stretched out endlessly before me. I could feel the chill of the sea air in my bones, but it was nothing compared to the unease that gnawed at my mind. The ship, my only companion for days now, was silent, as it had been ever since I boarded it. But this silence felt different, heavy, unsettling. I had no idea how I had ended up here. One moment I was at the port, watching ships come and go. The next, I found myself boarding an abandoned vessel that seemed to call to me, its peeling paint and broken windows a strange invitation. I had assumed it was a derelict ship, left to rot by its owners. But something about it drew me in, a pull that I couldn't explain, a whisper in the wind that seemed to urge me aboard. At first, the ship seemed harmless, empty shore, but that didn't seem unusual for a forgotten vessel. The creaking of the wood beneath my feet, the sound of the sails flapping in the wind. It was like the ship had been frozen in time. But as I wandered through its corridors, I realized something was off. The air was stale, as if it had been trapped here for years. The walls were covered in dust, but there was a faint smell, a mix of mildew and something more, pungent. And the strangest thing, the ship was moving. I hadn't noticed it at first, the movement so subtle that it almost felt like the world was swaying with me. But the further I explored, the more I felt it. Something was pushing the ship forward, through the ocean, despite there being no sign of a crew. As I made my way through the empty hallways, my footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness, I found the captain's quarters. The door creaked open with little resistance, and the sight that greeted me made my stomach turn. The room was pristine, untouched by time, with charts and maps neatly spread across the desk. The only thing out of place was the chair, a dark red stain that I couldn't quite make out. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and I instinctively stepped back, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I shouldn't have stayed. I should have turned around and left the moment I felt that odd sensation in the pit of my stomach. But there was something about the ship, a strange force that kept me from leaving. Every door I opened seemed to pull me deeper into its labyrinthine halls. And though I told myself I could leave whenever I wanted, I knew deep down that I was trapped. It wasn't until the sun began to set that the real terror set in. The ship, which had once been silent, began to hum, a low, almost imperceptible sound that vibrated through the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder until it seemed to come from all directions. The air became thick, heavy, with an unseen presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A shadow lurked at the edges of my vision, always just out of reach, never fully revealing itself. I found the dining room next, large, ornate, and completely empty. The table was set as if waiting for guests. Fine china, silver cutlery, everything meticulously arranged. The seats were empty, but there was one thing that caught my attention. At the far end of the table, a chair was pushed slightly out of place, as though someone had just gotten up. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, wondering if I was losing my mind. But as the minutes passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I had to leave. I rushed through the ship's corridors, my mind racing. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The light flickered, the temperature dropped, and then I heard it. A soft whisper, faint but unmistakable, like a voice from the other side of a dream. It called my name. The chill that ran down my spine wasn't from the cold. It was something much deeper, a primal fear that I couldn't explain. I turned quickly, searching for the source, but the hallway was empty. I had to get off the ship. I didn't care where it was going or why it had brought me here. I just needed to escape. But when I reached the deck, I was met with nothing but endless water. The shore was nowhere to be seen. The sky a solid inky black. The ship was adrift in the vast empty ocean. I could no longer see the coastline. My mind raced, panic rising in my chest. How long had I been on this ship? Days, weeks. The isolation began to settle in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the ship itself was alive. Alive in a way that no ship should be. As I stood there, trying to comprehend my situation, the wind picked up again, and I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The ship creaked, its timbers groaning under the pressure of the waves. And that's when I realized the truth. The ship wasn't abandoned. It had never been abandoned. It was waiting for me. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. After all, the human mind has a tendency to twist reality when faced with isolation. But the more I tried to rationalize the strange happenings, the more they insisted on being real. It started slowly at first. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. The faintest creak in the floorboards when I was sure I was alone. I would look and there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, nothing that should not have been there. I would brush it off, telling myself that it was just the ship settling, the natural noises that come with the decay of an old vessel. But there was an underlying tension in the air that made every creak of the timbers feel more like a warning than a comfort. I decided to explore more of the ship, trying to find something, anything, that could explain what was going on. But the deeper I ventured into the ship, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The further I got from the deck, the more I felt like the walls were closing in on me. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, each door leading to another identical corridor, each room seemingly more empty and forgotten than the last. The scent of mildew grew stronger as I moved forward, but there was something else. A faint, metallic odor lingering in the air, sharp and unsettling, as though something was rusting from within the walls themselves. I entered what appeared to be a lounge area, a place that might have once been a social hub for passengers. Judging by the old leather armchairs and the faded threadbare curtains hanging over the windows. But the lounge felt wrong. The dim flickering light from the overhead lamps cast long, uneven shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The room was too still, too quiet. The only sound was the occasional groan of the ship, the hull scraping against the waves, a constant reminder that we were still adrift in the vast, empty ocean. As I crossed the room, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A chair, positioned slightly off-center. A small detail, but it caught my attention. I didn't remember seeing it like that when I first entered. I hesitated, my gaze drawn to it. There was something about the way it sat there, as though it had been moved recently, and I could almost imagine the shape of a body that had just vacated it. I stood frozen for a moment, and that's when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It was the same whisper I'd heard before, the one that had called my name on the deck. But this time, it was different. This time, the voice was clearer, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel its intent, like a presence pressing against my skin. My heart began to race as I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the room. But once again, there was nothing. No one. I moved quickly toward the door, wanting to get out of that room, to escape the growing sense of dread that had settled over me. But as I reached for the handle, I froze once again. The door was warm to the touch. Unnaturally warm. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing in the hallway outside. They grew louder, closer, and I found myself paralyzed, unable to move. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, but there was nothing. The door remained still, and the footsteps didn't return. I exhaled, trying to calm my racing heart, but my hands trembled as I grasped the door handle again. I wrenched it open, half expecting something to rush past me, but the hallway beyond was empty. I quickly stepped into the corridor, scanning my surroundings, every creak of the ship's wood making me jump. There was no sign of anyone, no explanation for the footsteps, the whispering voice, the sudden warmth from the door. The ship was playing with my mind. I knew it. It had to be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was here with me. Something that wasn't quite human. Something that had been here long before I ever set foot on this cursed vessel. I began to move down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath me. The ship's sounds seemed to intensify as I walked, groaning beams, the dull thud of something shifting below deck, and the occasional unsettling clank of metal against metal. The ship was alive, I thought. It was alive, and it was watching me. As I approached the next staircase leading down into the lower decks, I hesitated. There was something down there, something I couldn't explain. I had no idea what it was, but every fiber of my being screamed at me not to go. But I had no choice. The pull was too strong. It was as though the ship itself was guiding me, urging me toward the unknown depths below. The stairs creaked as I descended into the gloom. The air grew colder, heavier, as if I was stepping into something far worse than a mere abandoned ship. The temperature dropped with each step, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My breath formed a mist in the frigid air, and I could see the dark outline of the lower decks stretching before me. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into a long corridor lined with doors. The smell of rust and decay was thick in the air, and the dim light from the overhead fixtures barely illuminated the space. The walls seemed to close in on me, the passageway impossibly narrow, like it was designed to trap anyone who dared venture this far. I could hear the whispers again, this time louder, clearer. They came from behind the doors, soft, hushed voices, like conversations just out of reach, filled with secrets and lies. The air felt charged, like the ship itself was alive, waiting for me to uncover its darkest truths. I walked toward the first door on my left, the rusted handle cool beneath my fingers. I hesitated before turning it, a feeling of dread pooling in my stomach. As I pushed the door open, the light flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, feeling my way through the pitch black. The room was small, cramped, and smelled of wet wood and mildew. I could hear something moving, something soft and shuffling. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound, but it was too faint. My heart thudded in my chest as I took another step forward. And then, I felt it, cold fingers, brushing against my arm. I spun around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though the ship was trying to tell me something. Something I wasn't meant to know. Something I had to find. But I knew, deep down, that finding it would be the end of me. And then, the door slammed shut behind me. I stumbled backward, the door slamming shut with a force that rattled the walls, leaving me trapped in the suffocating darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could feel the cold sweat drenching my palms. For a moment, I stood there, frozen in disbelief. The whispers had ceased, replaced by the deafening silence that swallowed the room whole. But that silence didn't feel safe. It felt oppressive, like something was watching me, waiting. I reached out, my hands trembling as I searched for the door handle. My fingertips brushed the cold metal, and I yanked it desperately. But the door didn't budge. Panic began to rise in my throat. I pulled harder, feeling the muscles in my arms strain. But the door was locked. There was no escape. I had to calm down. I couldn't let fear take control. I turned my back to the door and took a deep breath. The air in the room was thick, stale, and smelled of decay. Every breath felt like it was drawing me closer to something dark, something unnatural. My eyes were beginning to adjust to the darkness, and I could make out faint outlines of the room. A small cramped space with a single, rotting bed in the corner, its springs creaking under some unseen weight. A desk was nearby, its surface littered with what looked like broken glass and old papers. But what caught my attention was the large mirror that hung on the wall opposite me. It was cracked. Not just a small crack, but a spider web of fractures that spread across the surface like a broken web. The mirror was dark, reflecting nothing but the shadows in the room. And yet, it felt alive, as if something was trapped within it, waiting to break free. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. There was something about the mirror, something that pulled me in. My mind screamed at me to look away, but my body wouldn't obey. I took a step forward, my feet moving almost on their own. That's when I saw it. A faint outline, barely noticeable at first, but unmistakable once it became clearer. A figure standing behind me in the mirror. A figure that wasn't there in the room with me. It was tall, almost impossibly so, with limbs too long, and a shape that seemed to bend unnaturally in places. Its face was obscured by a dark shadow, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the room was empty. There was nothing behind me. I was alone. But the mirror, no, the reflection, was not. The figure remained frozen in place, its dark eyes locked on me. I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off the mirror. I couldn't explain it, I didn't want to. But deep down, I knew I wasn't just looking at my reflection anymore. I was looking at something else, something ancient and malevolent. It wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal, a doorway, to something far worse than I could ever imagine.
Suddenly, the room around me seemed to shift, the walls pulsating, as if the very ship were alive. The air grew colder still, and a low hum began to vibrate through the floor. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, deeper, a steady, rhythmic thrum that seemed to resonate within my chest. The whispers began again, but now they were louder, more urgent. They were coming from the mirror, from the figure within it. I stepped closer, unable to stop myself. My hand reached toward the mirror, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. As I touched the glass, it was ice cold, sending a shock wave through my arm. But that wasn't what made me pull my hand back in terror. It was the sensation. Something cold and foreign wrapping around my wrist like fingers, fingers that weren't mine. I yanked my arm back, stumbling away from the mirror. But as I turned to run, I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest. It was as though the air itself had turned into a blade, cutting through me. I gasped, clutching my chest, but the pain didn't stop. It intensified. I stumbled toward the door again, my mind racing. What was happening? Was it the ship? Was it the mirror? Was I losing my mind? But just as I reached the door, something stopped me. Something cold and sharp brushed against my neck. A breath, inhuman, fetid, crawled down my skin. I felt it. I felt the presence. It was behind me. Without thinking, I threw myself toward the door, slamming my shoulder into it. It didn't open, but the force of the impact sent me crashing to the floor. I scrambled back to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest as I looked around the room. That's when I saw it. The figure in the mirror was no longer a vague shape. It had moved. The figure was now standing directly behind me, its face, its twisted, malformed face, visible through the cracks. Eyes that were too large, too wide, stared out from under the shadowed hood that obscured its features. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged black teeth. It spoke, not with words, but with a sound, a horrible, guttural noise that vibrated in my bones. It was not a voice. It was a scream, a tortured wail of something beyond comprehension. The room around me seemed to pulse with it, the walls bending and warping as though they were alive. I had to get out. I had to escape. I lunged for the door again, my fingers scraping against the cold metal handle, desperately trying to force it open. But it was locked. I couldn't get out. I couldn't leave. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate steps coming from the hallway outside. It wasn't the same as before. These weren't the footsteps of a person. They were something else, something larger, something unnatural. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside. The door shook violently as though something, or someone, was trying to get in. I turned back to the mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing right behind me. But instead, the reflection was different. It was not me looking back at myself. It was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. A man, gaunt and pale, with wild, staring eyes. His mouth opened in a silent scream, his hands pressing against the glass as if begging for help. I screamed, but my scream was swallowed by the sound of the door bursting open. I turned to face the darkness. I didn't wait for the door to fully open. I bolted across the room, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet as I scrambled to the farthest corner. My pulse was deafening in my ears, my breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to be anywhere but here. The air had turned thick, suffocating, and with every step, I could feel the oppressive weight of something unseen following me. I dared a glance behind me. The hallway outside the room was empty. No one was there. But the footsteps, they continued, slow, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever it was savoring my fear. A shadow loomed at the end of the hall, too large to be human. My skin crawled as I felt the temperature drop even further. I had to get out. I didn't know how, but I had to escape this cursed ship. The ship. It was the ship, wasn't it? This place, this nightmare. It was the ship itself. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive. A malevolent presence that had existed for years, maybe centuries, wandering the ocean, feeding off the terror it instilled in the souls trapped aboard. I didn't know how I had ended up here, but I knew one thing. I was never supposed to leave. I reached the stairwell and hesitated. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step echoing loudly in the otherwise silent hall. It was as though the ship was listening, waiting. I felt its eyes on me. The whispers had begun again, softer this time, but more insistent, as if urging me to move faster, to go deeper into the heart of this cursed place.
But I was paralyzed. The staircase stretched before me, endless and dark, as if the very shadows were trying to swallow me whole. I couldn't go further. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run, to escape. But I couldn't. There was no escape from the ship. A door at the bottom of the stairs caught my eye. It was an old, rusted metal door, half open, just slightly ajar. It seemed like the only way out, the only place I hadn't explored. Something pulled me toward it, a sickening curiosity. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open and stepped into the room beyond. The air was stale, filled with the heavy scent of mildew and decay. But it wasn't the smell that made my blood run cold. It was the sight. The walls of the room were covered in old photographs, tattered, yellowed, faded. Faces that stared back at me, their eyes hollow, their smiles twisted. The faces of the missing, the forgotten. I moved closer to one of the photographs, drawn to it as if something beyond reason was pushing me forward. The photograph showed a group of people standing on the deck of the ship, all smiling, posing as though for a family portrait. But the smiles didn't reach their eyes. They looked wrong. The figures were too still, their postures too rigid, as if they were frozen in time, trapped in some sort of unnatural moment. My fingers brushed the glass of the frame, and the moment I touched it, the temperature plummeted. The room seemed to shift, the walls bending, the photographs warping and stretching. I backed away, my heart racing, but the air around me thickened, growing heavier with each breath. The room was closing in, suffocating me. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice, a low, guttural whisper, spoke. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but it was clear. It was the voice of the ship, of the thing that had been feeding off the souls aboard for all these years. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel them. They were like daggers in my mind, piercing through, tearing at my sanity. Suddenly, the photographs began to move. Slowly, at first, then faster, their faces twisting into expressions of terror, their eyes pleading for release. They screamed, their mouths opening wide, but no sound escaped, only the whispers, those horrid, distorted whispers. The ship was alive, feeding off their misery, trapping them in its never-ending cycle of torment. I turned, desperate to leave, but the door had vanished. The room had become a void, a place without escape. My feet stumbled as I backed toward the center of the room, my body aching with the cold, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The air around me was growing thicker, as though something invisible was tightening its grip on me, squeezing the life out of me. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, a symphony of tortured souls. And then I saw it. The figure, the one from the mirror. It was standing at the far end of the room, its elongated limbs stretched unnaturally, its face a shadowed mass of darkness. Its eyes glowed, an eerie, sickly green, and its mouth was twisted into a grin that made my stomach churn. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed by terror, trapped by its gaze. It reached out with one long, bony hand, and the room seemed to warp around it, the walls pulsating, breathing. I could feel the ship's presence closing in on me, its endless hunger, its dark, insatiable thirst for souls. The figure's hand brushed against my cheek, and I screamed. But the scream was drowned out by the sound of the ship, the creaking, groaning moaning of the ship itself. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness. I was sinking, falling into the void. And then nothing. I woke up on the deck. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the still empty sea. For a moment I thought it had all been a nightmare, some twisted figment of my imagination. But the emptiness that surrounded me, the eerie silence, it was real. The ship was still there, still moving, still drifting through the ocean, carrying its curse. I stood up, my legs weak beneath me. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone, no crew, no passengers, only the same haunted faces in the photographs. Only the whispers that I could still hear, faintly, on the wind. I tried to run, but it was no use. There was no escape. I had become one of them, one of the lost souls, trapped on a ship that wandered the ocean alone, carrying its dark secret with it for eternity. And I knew, deep down, I would never leave. The ship had claimed me. It had claimed us all. Forever.